and go.
Good evening, and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. I hope everyone is staying safe, wearing masks, and reading many biographies. My name is Kai Bird, and I am the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of City University of New York, and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. Please note that our next event is on October, October 29th, I believe. Hold on a minute. And I think it's October 29th with Justin Gifford for his biography of Eldridge Cleaver. But we are here tonight to celebrate a brand new biography by Heather Clark of Sylvia Plath called Red Comet, the short life and where is it? Heather, help me out here.
And Blazing Art of Sylvia Plath.
And the Blazing Art of Sylvia Plath. Titles are very hard to do, but this is a fabulous one. I think it's short and to the point and makes the reader curious to read the book. And the book is now on sale in your local bookstore and online, so please look for it. Heather will be in conversation with Ruth Franklin for about 45 minutes. Ruth and Heather are both closely associated with the Leon Levy Center, both having been former fellows. Ruth is the well-known biographer of, I'm sorry, I've lost my place.
Shirley Jackson.
Shirley Jackson. And I think on that note, I will let Ruth take it away. They will talk for about 45 minutes, followed by some Q&A. And you want to try to write your question in the question box down at the bottom. And there'll be plenty of time, I think, for Ruth to take as many questions as possible. So congratulations, Heather, and take it away, Ruth.
Great. Well, hi, Heather. It's so nice to see you, even in this
Ruth.
strange environment. And
I know.
welcome to everybody here. It's great to see that there's so many people gathered here to celebrate Heather's book. Even if we can't actually see you, we feel your virtual presence, and it's wonderful that this book is out in the world. This book that you've worked on for so long, and that I've been hearing about for so long. And in fact, I think the first time I heard about it shortly before we met was when you became a Leon Levy Fellow. And I remember Kai saying that it was hard to believe that the world needed another biography of Sylvia Plath. But in fact, after reading your application and your proposal, he was totally convinced that in fact, your biography of Sylvia Plath was exactly what the world needed. And when I got to read it in galleys this summer, I saw that he was absolutely right. And I felt, as I wrote you at the time, that you really have written the biography that Sylvia Plath always needed and that she deserved. Amazingly, the first biography really to take her seriously as both a poet and a person. And it's amazing, really, in retrospect, to think about how, Plath's life has been such a fertile ground for biographers to explore, and yet so many of them have just been salacious and have, focused on her love affairs and her breakdowns, and of course her eventual death by suicide rather than her work. And so I wondered maybe if you could start us off by telling us, what was it that led you to Plath in the first place, and how did you come to feel that another biography of her was, not only possible, but actually necessary?
Well, thank you, Ruth. Thanks so much for reading the book in the early stages and offering to do this event. And thank you to the Leon Levy Center as well. The Leon Levy Center was such an incredible source of moral and financial support when I was a fellow there a few years ago. So thanks. Yeah, I mean, I actually came to Sylvia Plath quite late, I think. I was asked to teach a class on a tutorial on Sylvia Plath in graduate school. And I hadn't really read her much as an undergraduate. In fact, the only woman poet I really read in any depth as an undergraduate was Emily Dickinson, which was great, but didn't know that much about Plath. When I taught her in graduate school, that was when I really became hooked. And of course, the best way to learn something is to teach it, right? So I completely over-prepared, read everything. And then I realized, oh my God, this is one of the most sophisticated and innovative poets I've ever read. And so I sort of put Plath on the back burner for a while. I was concentrating on post-war Irish poets at the time, but I wrote about Plath and Hughes in my second book, The Grief of Influence. And that book was a study of their sort of creative partnership and I wanted to explore how they had influenced each other as poets, really. And while I was writing that book, I started to think about this idea, or maybe I should write a Plath biography. And there are a lot of Plath biographies, and it's a very fair question, right? Why do we need another biography of Plath? But I kept, there were so many good biographies of other prominent women writers like Virginia Woolf, for example, or, Edna St. Vincent Millay, or Jean Rhys, or even Nora Barnacle had a long biography, James Joyce's wife. And I just thought, this is so bizarre that Sylvia Plath doesn't have this big, long, serious biography. And so I saw that as a gap, and that maybe that's something I could sort of argue in a proposal trying to get a publisher to take this on, that this didn't exist, and that most Plath biographies sort of maxed out around 300 or 400 pages. So that was just a very practical way to kind of differentiate what I was doing.
Wait, can we just pause there for 1 second? I want to hear the rest of it, but I just want to ask you that I find that such an interesting way to approach biography. So you knew from the beginning that you wanted to write a large book. How did you know that? And I'll just say for those of I assume that probably nobody who's listening has the book in their hands yet.
Unfortunately, sorry.
It's over 1,000 pages.
This is the British version.
Hefty book.
Yeah.
So, and I will say also, it's a page turner. It does not feel like 1,000+ page biography, and yet here we are. And so, that was actually something I wanted to ask you, is why you chose this particular approach of telling her life in great, really comprehensive detail.
Yeah, I mean, I just that sort of practical thought that, well, this is something I can highlight as I try to get a publisher, that this hasn't been done. But also, I guess I read the previous Plath biographies and I really wanted to know more, right? And I felt like there was more to be told. I knew that Plath's letters were coming out in 2018, her collected letters, meticulously edited by Karen Kukil and Peter Steinberg. So I knew that was in the pipeline, and that was part of the decision, knowing that every surviving letter Plath ever wrote would soon be published, made a big, long biography seem a lot less intimidating. And of course, I'd gone to the archive already and taken photos of like all the letters. So I had them on my computer, but it's just so much easier to consult a published book. I knew other archives would be opening up. I knew there was more in the Ted Hughes archives at Emory and the British Library, because I had been through those for my second book. So I thought there was more, there was a longer story to tell.
There's so few women writers who actually have gotten that treatment, right? I mean, Virginia Woolf and Edith Wharton both have really long, serious biographies by Hermione Lee. who else, whereas, for the male authors, it's basically standard, right? You've got the 3-volume,
Absolutely.
2,400 pages about Graham Greene, and,
Yeah.
obviously I
Yeah.
can go on.
Yeah. And you mentioned Hermione Lee. She's been a huge influence on my sense of what biography is, and her Virginia Woolf biography was really what I had in mind when I was writing this, and what I sort of aspired to. And I kind of, I hope to give Sylvia Plath the Hermione Lee treatment, for lack of a better phrase. But absolutely, she was an influence. I didn't quite think it would be 1,000 pages. I thought maybe 600 or 700, but it ended up being very, very long. But I wanted Plath to take up that space on the bookshelf. I wanted her to have that kind of 3-inch take up. I think, as you say, there are so few big biographies of women, and to me that was a feminist act. Was writing this big biography, wanting Plath to take up that space that's often reserved for men, right? Biographies of men. And so that certainly was part of it. And then, of course, as you mentioned in the beginning, I wanted to tackle some of the more damaging stereotypes that have dogged Plath since her death by suicide. And I felt that her name had almost become synonymous with madness and tragedy and suicide, and that seemed unfair and wrong. And I wanted to kind of flip the script on that. And again, Hermione Lee, there's a quote from Hermione Lee that I would have pinned over my computer or on a bulletin board if I had a bulletin board in front of my computer. And this sentence, when I read it, that was sort of my aha moment. I have to write this book. When in her biography, her very short introduction to biography, she says, women writers whose lives have involved self-abuse, suicide, mental illness, are often treated biographically as victims or case histories first and professional writers second. And that was the quote that just lit the fire.
That's so profound.
Yeah. When I read that, I think she may have been talking about Virginia Woolf, but I just thought that's absolutely true of Sylvia Plath. And so all of these things kind of aligned in my mind, and I was casting around for a third project, and I just decided to go for it.
Wow. And so you decided to just throw yourself and, all your resources into this incredibly, I assume absorbing, but also very, very demanding process. Can you talk a little bit about, I know you were working on this book for around 10 years, right?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about just what the process was like? I mean, where do you start when you're writing a biography of someone like Sylvia Plath?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, because I spent about 5 years writing the Grief of Influence about Plath and Hughes, so I had a good critical foundation, I thought, to embark upon a Plath biography, and I knew where all the archival papers were, and so I started this book in 2011, and I started. I mean, I wish I had a more interesting story about the process and how I went about it. But I started at the beginning of her life. I mean, I really took a very chronological approach. I started with the genealogy and worked my way, to 1963. And I did that because I thought that the observations would build, and that would maybe help clarify things later down the line. Although, I've talked to other biographers who have started at the end of a life and worked their way towards the beginning, and I find that incredibly interesting too. But yeah, I took a very sort of traditional chronological approach.
Yeah, I mean, there's not always a huge amount of mystery to how we write biography, right?
Yeah.
I mean, were there we talked about the pathology issue. Were there other kind of myths about Sylvia Plath or, misunderstandings that you kind of set out deliberately to correct?
I think, I mean, so much of it was pushing against this idea of her as a sort of witchy death goddess kind of figure. And I guess I thought so much recent scholarship has been incredible. There's almost a renaissance in Plath studies right now. And the recent scholarship has really, I think, brought home how ironic a writer she was. And she was just this master of performance. And so the recent scholars have kind of questioned this idea of how confessional a writer was she really, right? She's writing with such a sense of irony. So that was something I also wanted to push a little bit. And also this, I felt the scholarship that had not gotten through, I think, to the popular imagination. I still felt she was a cliche in the media. And that, I'll just give you like a really egregious example of that. There was a 2017 edition of Spanish Glamour magazine, and there was a Sylvia Plath fashion spread. And in this fashion spread, there were really cute sunglasses and purses from the 1950s and coats and sweaters and scarves. And then there was a big pink gas oven in this fashion spread. Yeah, and that's the kind of thing that just makes me see red.
I mean, that's just incredibly tasteless.
It's just tasteless. It's appalling. That's an egregious form of what I'm talking about. But even, you know what? Actually, so let me just show you sort of a more subtle thing about what I'm talking about. So this is, I don't know if people can see this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is the cover of Sylvia Plath's collected poems.
That's like one of those old Faber editions.
Yeah, it's a Faber edition. The cover came off a few days ago. Sorry about that. But so what does Sylvia Plath look like she's doing in this picture?
Yeah, I mean, I can't totally see it, but she's got her head down. Is there something on her shirt that I can't see?
Yeah, I mean, there's like a pin on her shirt.
She's not doing anything, actually.
Yeah,
right? She's just kind of looking down in this very demure sort of way.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very passive drawing. I feel like she looks kind of morose and sad in the drawing. This drawing is actually based on a figure of Sylvia Plath looking down at her typewriter typing.
Oh, yeah. They cropped that out.
They cropped right. So I don't have the real photo handy, but because this was just an impulsive thing that I had on my desk. But that's what I mean. Like,
I mean, I'm speechless. I mean, I shouldn't be anymore because like we know all this stuff already, but I'm actually still speechless by the idea that like her own publisher would commission this lovely drawing of her and cut out the typewriter, the aspect of her life that obviously was the most important. But I mean, a lot of what you've done in this book is to unearth some of, a lot of the examples of sexism, both kind of implicit and explicit that she faced, during her life. And of course, after her death, her reputation suffered from all that. I mean, I mean, I absolutely hate this term and I hate the question when it's asked to me. But did you intend, I won't say a feminist agenda, but did you go, because that's the term I hate so much, but did you go into the project knowing that you were going to take a feminist approach to Plath's life, or was that something that kind of, built as you went through the material and developed a larger picture of her?
Yeah, I mean, I think insofar as that Hermione Lee, idea of treating women writers who have suffered, in their lives, death by suicide or mental illness, this kind of thing, and treating them as professional writers first, and really trying to tell that story and before the other story. That to me is a feminist act, and I think feminist scholars definitely informed my perspective, especially the first wave, I suppose, of feminist scholars write about Plath, who opened up so many new pathways, like Marjorie Perloff and Diane Middlebrook and Susan Van Dyne and Linda Bunsen and Jacqueline Rose and many others. And so that informed my own scholarly perspective, and certainly Elaine Showalter's work, The Female Malady, informed my own understanding of Plath's treatment. Showalter's study about women in madness was really influential. So a lot of feminist scholars definitely informed my perspective, and I wanted to highlight in the book. I mean, I feel like I take quite a historical approach, even though I'm a literary scholar, but I tried to.
Biography makes us all historians.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. I'm sort of a wannabe historian, I think. But I tried to really put her life in historical context as much as possible and bring in a lot of that social history. And so to that extent, I wanted to highlight the everyday, casual, breezy sexism that she had to face. And it was just so ingrained, and it was shocking to me. I mean, that was one of the most shocking things about this book, this whole project, to read the speech of the Democratic candidate for president, Adlai Stevenson, his 1955 Smith commencement speech, telling these brilliant young women assembled before him that they should embrace the humble role of the housewife. I mean, those are his words. It's so shocking to me, and I can't imagine that happening today. So we've come.
Thank goodness, right?
Yeah, thank goodness. But this is the world she lived in, and it was the Anglo-American literary world was almost completely run by men, and so I wanted to try to highlight how hard she had to fight to fulfill her own sense of vocation and to honor her own ambition to be a woman writer, and so in that sense, that was a feminist impulse as well.
I think we've all had moments like that, when researching our books, looking at something in the past and just being, blown away by how different conditions were. And for me, it was discovering that the book section of The Atlantic used to be called Of Ideas and Men.
Oh my God. Right.
I mean, that just killed me. But one thing I found so interesting was the parts where you are looking into the culture of the women's magazines of the 50s, at the time when Plath had her guest editorship at Mademoiselle, which, I guess I always assumed was sort of a glorified internship. And I was so surprised to learn from your book that she actually had to, do real work and edit and be managing editor for the magazine. You have this wonderful observation of just like looking at the ads for corsets and girdles and all that in the magazine, and noticing just how hard it was for women literally to physically exist in the world as bodies bodies in motion, right? They were all the garments of the era were literally meant to keep them in their place. And I was there's this poem that you quote that really moved me to tears about how these women, I don't remember the exact words, but it's like, we have energy and brains and great style, but we're writing ad copy for brassiers. And it was just like in those lines was all the tragedy of that era for these young, ambitious women who had so few possibilities for what to do with their ambition.
Yes, I actually found that jingle that you're talking about. I can read it really quickly.
Yeah, read it. I'm sure everybody's wanting to hear it.
Okay. We're ready to wow lifetime, fortune, and loose. We've energy, brains, and when we turn on the juice, our style is so subtle it drives men to tears. But we're doing the copy of ads for brassieres.
It makes me just want to tear my hair out. Yeah, when you say lifetime fortune, those are obviously the magazines. By those titles, these women wanted to be on the staff of these magazines, and their options were so limited. And I thought, it's fascinating to me also in your analysis of the bell jar, whereas so many readers have basically just assumed that the book is autobiographical and that's where it ends. You actually read it as a novel of social protest against the way female psychiatric patients were treated in that era. Can you say a little bit about that and what you learned about Plath's treatment at the hands of these psychiatrists?
Yeah, I mean, that was another shocking thing for me to learn more about. So I went to McLean Hospital and got the tour and spent the afternoon talking to the archivist, and I was able to go through a lot of the newsletters from 1953 and 54, just which gives you a sense of the McLean culture and that kind of thing. I also interviewed a psychiatrist who was there when Sylvia was there. And so I learned a lot about psychiatric treatment in the 1950s. And one thing that became very clear to me, and this wasn't something that I discovered or anything like that. I mean, people had known about this, but Plath's first electroshock therapy treatment was really badly mismanaged, and I think was just traumatic for her. And one of the psychiatrists I spoke with said, "Oh yeah, that asylum was notorious for just doing shock treatment for profit. Like they would just, they just wanted to make money." And he said it had just a terrible reputation in Boston. He called them shock artists. And so, getting that kind of information, and of course she herself wrote very movingly about how awful that had been for her. And, they were still doing lobotomies at McLean in 1953, which is the year Plath was admitted. And her own psychiatrist had approved a lobotomy on one of her patients in 1953. So, yeah, and so that sort of thing was shocking to me. And it helped me understand Plath's fear of institutionalization later in her life. And just this sense that she had no autonomy, that she could end up at the hands of, uncaring or unsympathetic doctors who didn't know her well. And of course, when she was in England later in her life, she didn't have a benefactress like Olive Higgins Prouty paying the bills anymore. And just learning more about her psychiatric treatment made me understand her fear of those treatments. And another point I make in the book about her psychiatric treatment is that, as in Virginia Woolf's case, I think it's hard to disentangle the effects of her quote-unquote cures for depression from the depression itself, and how are those two things, how do they influence each other? And I think we at least have to allow for the possibility, that some of these treatments actually could have made her worse.
Right, you have a lot of informed speculation about her drug interactions.
Yeah, which weren't well understood at the time. I mean, this was sort of the infancy of antidepressants, and she was on taking a few different medications, and a lot of people near the end of her life talk about her slurring her words and lapsing back into an American accent and seeming really out of it. And I mean, I don't know, but it just, again, I think we need to at least allow for the possibility that the treatment could have had some, ill effect. So
yeah, I think, understanding her very real fear that her autonomy could be taken away from her, and through this treatment, it makes all those, really powerful assertions of her autonomy, of her free will, her creative power in her poetry. It makes all that feel so much more striking, I think.
Yeah, and there was still such a stigma towards mental illness in those days. And I remember there still is. And I interviewed one of her neighbors in Wellesley, and he remembered his mother helping to drive her to her early shock treatments in the summer of 1953. And he said that, the shame was so much that it wasn't even, it brought shame to the entire neighborhood, not even just the Plath household. And at that time, again, we're talking 1953, and I think, so, you know, she's a very proud woman, and maybe didn't, and I think her mother didn't necessarily have the right language to discuss mental illness with her.
But who did really at that time?
Who did,
right?
exactly.
Yeah, it's striking because 1953 is also when Shirley Jackson had her first real breakdown. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think listeners are going to have a sense just from the way you're talking about the book that you really took this, you know, leave no stone unturned approach. You know, you're interviewing the neighbors. You tracked down, it seems, an incredible number of people. All these women who were her fellow guest editors at Mademoiselle, people she went to school with. What was it like meeting all these people whose lives had touched hers, and you know, either in a tangential way or a really profound way?
Oh, I'm so humbled by the people that I got to meet. I'm so grateful for the chance to speak about Sylvia Plath with them, and they were all, they wanted to talk. I mean, obviously they wanted to talk about her, otherwise they wouldn't have said yes to the interview. But I felt like they really enjoyed remembering her and bringing out the happiness that they had known in her. I got a lot of that, these very sort of joyful memories and exuberant memories. I mean, especially from some of the Smith friends, and not so much from the friends in England who remembered her at a different part of her life, but so many of the Smith era or Wellesley era friends just remembered her lust for life and her incredible appetite, you know, her literal appetite, and her appetite for, you know, for travel, and she wanted to cook, and she wanted to draw, and she wanted to, you know, do this and that, and just her desires, and they, you know, she was an inspiration to them. And so meeting those people was one of the highlights of this research. And quite a few of them still expressed the sense that if only I had known, or I could have helped, if only I had been there, you know, if I had known, I would have flown over to England, or I heard that a lot. So that emotion was still quite raw, actually, with a lot of people. I heard it over and over again. If only I had known, if only I could have done X, Y, Z, but of course, how could they have known?
Yeah. So we have, let's see, it looks like we have about 7 or 8 more minutes for our conversation. So I'm just going to encourage everybody who's listening, please do submit questions via this, you know, odd little chat box, and I will look at them and pose them to Heather. In the meantime, of course, I have, you know, plenty more questions of my own, but let's talk about something more fun. Travel. You did a lot of travel for this book, right? You stayed in Ted Hughes' house at one point, right? Tell us about that.
Yes. So one of the fun things about writing this book was getting to travel to England so much, although that posed a very practical challenge because I had young children in the house, and thank God my mother offered to come and help out. I owe her a lot. But I did spend the summer, or 5 weeks of the summer of 2017, living in Ted Hughes' house, and I brought my family over for some of that. And I slept in the room where he was born, and I got to meet lots of local people who either knew Hughes and Plath or whose parents had known them, and made a lot of local connections that way. And that was really important for me as an American coming into that fairly alien culture. I mean, I had lived in England. I went to graduate school in England, but Yorkshire was a different place than Oxford. So,
say a little bit about that. Like, I think, like, basically all I know about Yorkshire is the Secret Garden, right?
Yeah. Well, I loved following in their footsteps in the Calder Valley. So, you know, this was Hughes's, the center of his psychic geography, right? He called it element. It was he thought of this area in West Yorkshire as the last Celtic kingdom, and he thought of it as paradise in a way. And Sylvia fell in love with it as well when they visited his parents in the village of Heptonstall shortly after they were married. And so they took a lot of hikes across the moors, and I followed in their footsteps. I hiked out to Top Withens, which is the site of the alleged site of Wuthering Heights, and took these hour-long walks on the moors, just sort of trying to immerse myself in that landscape and understand what it was about that landscape that drew Ted Hughes to write some of his best poems, and also Sylvia Plath. I mean, she wrote a lot of poems about the moors as well, and she said it was the only landscape where she didn't miss the ocean. So, but also just understanding kind of the way that social class worked in that area. I had a lot of conversations about that with people, and just getting a better handle on Hughes and his childhood and that sort of thing.
Yeah,
So,
and I'm interested, thinking about biography in the era of COVID, which I guess now we have to. I wonder how exactly you feel that that travel brought you closer to Hughes and to Plath, and would there be a way to make up for that in a world where in fact our travel is limited in a way that it hasn't been before?
Yeah, I have thought of this because I didn't think the travel would make that much of a difference at the beginning. And then by the end of the project, I realized how important it had been to visit every single house that Sylvia Plath had lived in, to visit.
And why? What was it? How did you feel like that brought you closer to her life?
Yeah, just having these visuals in my mind when I was writing. I had an actual picture, a clear sense of how big the house had been, or how small the flat had been. In many cases, they lived in these tiny flats. And I went to Sylvia Plath's last house in London, her townhouse, and I was given a tour of that house on Fitzroy Road, and that was, I never thought I would be able to go in there, but the owner very kindly let me in after I wrote her letter, and I got to see, Sylvia Plath's bedroom study where she wrote some of her greatest poems, and I got to see the view out of her bedroom study window, and that's sort of what I wanted to see. What was she looking at when she wrote these poems? Because I knew that she had positioned her desk in front of a window. So seeing
what was
views
she
like
looking at?
It's just the roofs of Camden, really. But the skyline was quite beautiful. She was high up, so the clouds on that day at least were spectacular. So I think that I don't know how to replace that in the age of COVID, and I'm concerned because I'm going to be writing another book soon too. But I don't. We might have to come up with another way. I mean, maybe Zoom tours of writers' houses. I don't know. I don't know. I wish I had a better answer, but it meant a lot to me to go to all of those places and try to immerse myself as much as I could.
Before we turn to questions, tell us a little bit about your next project, since you just alluded to it.
Yeah, I'm going to write a book about poetry in Boston in the 50s and 60s. It's under contract with Knopf, and I'm going to be focusing on the women, on Plath, Anne Sexton, Adrienne Rich, and Maxine Kumin, their successes, their sorrows, their rivalries, their friendships in Boston. So sort of Boston years of them finding a voice as poets.
And how do you feel about, what is it like to be writing a group biography after you've focused so, single-mindedly on one person?
Yeah, I knew that I didn't have it in me to write another 800-pager. I wanted to spread my wings a bit and write something shorter. And when I wrote the Boston chapter in my Plath biography, I felt like there was so much more there, and that felt like the foundation of a book to me. So that sort of came out of the biography. And my first book was sort of a group biography. It was about poets in Belfast, Seamus Heaney, Michael Longley, Derek Mahan, Paul Muldoon, and they all knew each other in the 60s and 70s in Belfast, and I talked about their responses to the political situation there and how they kind of came of age as poets at that time. So I have a bit of a template.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we'll see.
I think you mentioned before that this book originally was longer and you had to cut a fair amount of material out. I wonder, did this Boston project come out of material that you had cut from the Boston years of the book? And what else is missing that readers might miss out on?
Yeah, I did end up cutting some of the Boston chapter, and I before I knew I was going to write this book, but especially later when I had that idea. And most of the material cut was from the first half, absolutely. It was originally about 2,000 pages. I cut it down to about 1,600 pages. Now we're talking double-spaced Microsoft Word font 12. I mean, I wasn't using a tiny font or anything like that. And then my editor, Deb Garrison, helped me cut another, I don't know, 200 or 300 pages out of it. But it was from her childhood, her adolescence, her some of her Smith years. And I know some of my Plath Scholar friends think that, oh, you should have left more of that in. But I trust my editor's judgment, and I think it was the right call. But I also think it was worth exploring in some depth because, sadly, she lived a very short life, and I think her experiences in the first half of her life, it all kind of contributed to what happened later, and it laid a foundation. And boyfriends like Dick Norton, he's one of the main characters in The Bell Jar. It's based on him. So I wanted to give people like that attention. So
good, wonderful. Well, okay, so I'm looking at these questions now. Okay, here we have a question. Okay, asking about Plath's poetics. Okay, well, this is something that I, as a biography maniac, have not really got into. How did she see herself in the spectrum of her day's poetic affiliations and approaches, the Beats, the New Americans, confessional poets, etc.? Can you talk a little bit about where she placed herself and where others placed her?
Yeah, well, I talk a lot about this in the book, maybe even too much, because again, I wanted to give a social history of the Anglo-American poetry world at that time. So Plath and Hughes they felt a bit of contempt for the movement, which was the dominant mode of British poetry in the 50s and 60s. How much contempt they really felt is up for debate, but in writing, they profess to feel great contempt for the movement, and they wanted to write a poetry that was sort of bolder, less genteel. That was a word that got thrown around a lot at that time, and that sort of Plath said, "I want to break out of my glass call," and she felt that she needed to kind of break through to this bolder, more raw aesthetic. They were entranced by the work of Yeats and D.H. Lawrence and Dylan Thomas, and so I think Plath and Hughes shared that kind of wilder aesthetic. And when Plath took Robert Lowell's creative writing class in the spring of 1959, I think that was an important turning point for her because her college poems are very tightly structured, very formal. She writes villanelles and sestinas and rondeau like a pro, but she kept thinking, I need to break through somehow. And when she took Robert Lowell's class and she met Anne Sexton in that class, these were people who had experiences in mental hospitals, who had suffered from depression, things that had happened to her, and they wrote about it, and that helped release something in her. That year, she goes to Yaddo. She writes a lot of what are now considered breakthrough poems, and I think she's on her way. Whether or not she's she thought of herself as a confessional poet. She actually was at a dinner party with the man who coined the term confessional poetry, M.L. Rosenthal, and there's an interview with him in an archive where he talks about this conversation he had with Sylvia Plath about confessionalism. I think it was in 1960 or 1961, and she said to him, I want to use personal experiences, but it has to transcend the personal. So she felt like her poems had to transcend that. They couldn't just be about the personal, they had to be more universal. So that was a very interesting story to me, kind of, as I was wondering, did she think of herself as a confessional poet, right? So maybe yes, but I think Ted Hughes had some disrespect for confessional poetry at that point. I think that also influenced her understanding of herself, but they definitely thought of themselves as rebelling against the current aesthetic, the current poetic aesthetic, and almost like punk rock. I mean, it was a fairly dramatic rebellion in their eyes. Yeah.
The whatever it is, I'm against it school.
Yeah. Yeah. But their poems are so, I mean, they're still formalists, right? They're still, even in a poem like Daddy, Plath is still using regular stanza structures, and she's using rhyme, and she doesn't let it all hang out. She doesn't just jettison all of that, and neither does Hughes. So yeah. So they're still sort of these, secret formalists.
So here's an interesting question about Plath and Hughes and their relative positions in the canon. Christina writes, what have I done here? Okay. Plath has an iconic place in American literature, which evolved almost immediately after her death. At that time, as I remember, Hughes was forgotten in her wake. How's that perspective changed in the UK? How would you respond to that?
Yes, yeah. I think in a simple word, yes. I think Hughes is much more read in the UK than he is here.
I mean, I actually studied Hughes in graduate school here.
Oh, okay. Well,
I don't know how unusual that is, but
yeah, I mean, he's more of a kind of national poet, right? He was poet laureate, and his poems are on the A levels and things like that, and so I think there's more familiarity with his work, maybe a bit more respect for his work in the UK. He for a long time he stopped coming to America because he was harassed at poetry readings and things like that. And in one letter to a friend, he called America enemy country. So I think that did affect. Yeah, I think it did affect his reputation. But now I think his reputation is quite high in the UK. Quite.
And what about Plath's reputation?
I think it equal or better. I mean, absolutely. I think she.
One thing I'm struck by is you mentioned not having read Plath in school or at university or in graduate school, and certainly I didn't either. And I wonder if that's changed today, or about this disparity between her position, in the popular canon of people who read poetry, as much as there is such a thing, and the academic canon.
Yeah, I think that I don't have any sort of scientific data to back this up, but I feel like the bell jar is something that a lot of people often read in high school, but that maybe the poetry isn't as widely disseminated. My guess is that more Americans have read the bell jar than Ariel, but maybe more people in the UK have read Ariel. I know Plath's. Yeah, I never studied Plath in America at Harvard, but at Oxford she was on their curriculum. She was on their kind of set English lit curriculum, and that's why I was asked to teach a tutorial on her. And I found that quite interesting too. That she was part of the Oxford English lit.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's a question about the publishing industry's role in producing these biographies. Okay, you mentioned that there are a few long biographies of women, Yes. What is the role of publishers in valuing the lives of women and encouraging long biographies? And then we've actually got a related question from somebody who points out about, again, on the size of women's biographies. She says, sorry, I'm just assuming this is a woman, dashed downstairs to look at my bookshelves and found big biographies on Elizabeth Gaskell, Olive Schreiner, the Brontes. But then, as you say, we jump to Woolf. What is this about? So I guess I wonder, was there a higher tolerance in the past for large biographies of women, or maybe large biographies in general? And what's the situation today? Did you have any pushback from your publisher? I mean, it sounds like they didn't want you to publish a 2,000-page book.
Right. Yeah, and I,
enough,
obviously knew that was ridiculous. I was nervous, actually, because I had contracted to write a sort of 500-600 sort of thing, but I was given the time and the space that I wanted, and I received no pushback, and I'm very grateful for that. I think, well, these biographies, they take so long to write, and they're very expensive to write. I mean, you kind of have to have a day job as well. And it was such a struggle with small children writing this biography. It was just a daily struggle to find the time to write. I had a baby about 2 years into this. I had a 3-year-old, and then 2 years in, I had a baby. And so just as a mother approaching this project, I thought many times, how can I possibly do this? How can I finish this and not shortchange my children? And I don't know if that plays into people's calculations, but honestly, Sylvia Plath inspired me because she was someone who managed her time so efficiently with young children, and I was in awe of what she was able to produce with a couple toddlers running around. But yeah, I don't know. That's a really good question, and that I don't necessarily have a good answer for. But yeah, there seems to be a gap.
Did you feel like becoming a mother as you were working on this project, or I guess shortly before, did that affect your view of Sylvia Plath? Did you feel it was important to be a person who was a mother as you wrote this book?
I felt like I understood the struggle to find time to write better than I might have, because it was just a visceral thing for me too. And one of the leitmotifs in her letters during the last, 6 months or so is, I need a nanny. I need a nanny. I need to write these poems that I know are inside me. I need to write my next novel, but I cannot do it without a nanny. I can't find the headspace. And I really understood. I felt like I understood that so much, and I felt so much compassion for her, and in that struggle, and not giving up in the face of raising 2 young children on her own, more or less, in the last few months. But she still showed such a determination to at least try to again fulfill this sense of vocation that she had. But yeah, I felt like it certainly brought me closer to her as a subject.
Yeah. Here's a question, I suppose for us both. How aware were Shirley Jackson and Sylvia Plath of one another's work? It's an interesting question, I think, not necessarily for the answer, which is, I guess, that Plath seems like she was more aware of Jackson than Jackson was aware of her, that she actually she wanted to interview Jackson for Mademoiselle, and she read The Bird's Nest, right?
She did.
She read,
yeah.
I don't know if she read any other of Jackson's novels. Whereas Jackson, I don't think, was especially interested in contemporary poetry, and may not have been aware of Plath's work, to the best of my knowledge. But that kind of raises a larger point for me, just in terms of the interconnectedness of women writers of this period in general. And it struck me from working on that book, and I wonder how it seems to you, that Jackson actually was quite isolated. She didn't have a large community around her of fellow women writers whom she could, reach out to. And bounce ideas off of and all that stuff. It seems like Plath, in fact, was quite connected. She had a huge social scene around her and then around her and Hughes. But in terms of having, that kind of relationships, did she have close relationships with other women other women writers or women whom she trusted to talk to her about her writing?
Yeah, I go over this a bit at the end of the book. It strikes me as slightly tragic. She was trying to make connections with women writers in London when she moved to London on her own in December of 1962. She wanted to meet Stevie Smith. She wrote to Stevie Smith and said, I love your work. Can we meet? Can you come over for tea? Stevie Smith replied, absolutely, let's do it. But it never happened. I mean, she died in early February of 63. She wanted to meet Emily Hahn, who was a New Yorker writer, who she knew through a friend, and she was trying to set that up. She did meet Doris Lessing in the fall of 1962 in London, and Doris Lessing didn't like Sylvia Plath. She asked this mutual friend,
not a super nurturing figure.
Yeah, well, she asked the mutual friend, not to bring Sylvia Plath around again because Sylvia Plath gushed too much. Now, Sylvia Plath had read the Golden Notebook and taken notes in the Golden Notebook. You can read her marginalia. It's at the Morgan Library in New York City, and I've looked at it. It's fascinating. So Sylvia Plath was really wanted to meet Lessing and was, I think, inspired by the Golden Notebook, but that didn't take. And so at the end of her life, she was she was isolated. Strangely. So that's one of the what might have been for me, if she had been able to connect with these other women writers in London in 1963.
Yeah. Okay, here's another interesting one. Who is your favorite unsung poet? Is there anyone you'd love to write about that you feel isn't well known enough to be able to sell a biography of that person? I guess, before, maybe last year, I would have said that Maxine Cumin might fall into that category.
Yeah, and I guess I am writing a book partly about her. So, yeah, I did feel that she hasn't received as much attention as maybe she should. And the other three are much bigger, better known, household names, if you will, are better known. But yeah, I'm excited to start working on her more, giving her more attention.
Yeah. Is there somebody else? I mean, there must be. I think there are a lot of women writers strewn throughout history.
Yeah, I mean, I love the work of Yvonne Boland, the Irish. She's fairly well known, but no biography of her. And Maeve McGuckian, Northern Irish poet. Sinead Morrissey, another Northern Irish poet. I love their work. So maybe one of those, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And what about other biographers? You mentioned Hermione Lee, of course, but are there other biographers who are particularly influential on you?
Lyndall Gordon. I loved her biography of T.S. Eliot. I used to use that biography in class when I taught Eliot. I would actually make my students read parts of it when we were reading The Wasteland or Four Quartets. I would assign that, which isn't standard, right, in literature classes.
Not at all. No, people pretend biography doesn't exist, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I thought it was really important, and I thought it helped illuminate the work, especially when the work is obscure like that and kind of hard to grab onto if you're an undergraduate. So yeah, I really appreciated her work. And it sounds cliched, but the Ellman biography of James Joyce left a huge impression on me as a college student. I just fell in love with it, and that was partly what brought me to Irish literature, was Ellman's biography of Joyce.
One last one here. Okay, what do you think about the feminist rage toward Ted Hughes among feminists in the 1960s and 70s?
I think I understand it. I think when someone dies by suicide, there's always this, someone needs to be blamed. Someone needs to take responsibility for that. And so Ted Hughes was someone who I think bore the brunt of that for a while. I think also Sylvia Plath's mother did as well, Aurelia Plath, and even Assia Wevel. So I certainly I understand why it happened, and I talk in my book. I mean, they had a very stormy last couple of years of their marriage. I mean, the marriage was idyllic and quite happy in the beginning, but it came to a terrible end. And I quote a lot from Plath's letters about the breakdown of the marriage, because those were letters that had never been featured in a biography before. There were 14 letters that she had sent to her psychiatrist around the time the marriage was ending. And I just thought it was important to hear Plath's voice.
How did you happen to come by those letters?
Oh, they were published in the collected letters. So the editors, it's a long story, but a woman named Harriet Rosenstein, who had started a Plath biography in the 70s but never finished it, somehow got Dr. Boischer, then Dr. Barnhouse, to give her these letters from Sylvia Plath. So she had these letters. Boischer asked for them back. She wouldn't give them back. It became a lawsuit, a recent lawsuit. Smith College sued Rosenstein for these 14 letters, and Smith won the lawsuit because Smith owned Boischer's papers, and they argued that these really should be in their collection. So it's kind of a long story. I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but
the politics of the archive.
Yeah, the politics. Yeah. But Frieda Hughes allowed these letters to be put into the published collected letters, volume 2, and they, they're heartbreaking. They're very upsetting, but they do shed more light, I think, on the marriage.
Yeah.
But it was important for me to give Plath's voice, to give a sense of her perspective.
So just to end on a more positive note, what was your aim? What did you hope to achieve with this book?
Just a very simple aim. I hope to convince whoever needs more convincing that Sylvia Plath was one of the greatest writers of the 20th century, and that her work shouldn't be taken any less seriously because she's a woman, or because she suffered from depression, or because she died by suicide. And that's really, I just wanted to reposition her as one of the most important writers of the 20th century. So a simple aim.
Well, I'm 100% certain that your book has accomplished that. And, Heather, thank you so much. I think this has been a really wonderful conversation. I've learned so much from you, and I'm sure all of our listeners have too. And, as a biographer, I find this really inspirational. So, congratulations on your amazing work with this book. And I'm sure everybody here joins me in wishing you so much success as you take it out into the world.
Thank you, Ruth. And I really admire your work as well. So I'm honored that you agreed to do this with me. It's fantastic.
My pleasure. All right. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Good night.